In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the opening introduction to the education of Augie Merasty and the memoir. So Augie's memoir is, chapters 1 through 9, but there's an introduction and an afterword that are sort of the framing narrative of Augie's memoir, and they're written by David Carpenter. And David Carpenter is the editor or co-writer of Augie's manuscript, and he was the one who sort of compiled the manuscript, all of Augie's sort of handwritten recollections of what happened to him. Carpenter is the one who sort of put those together into kind of a coherent narrative with chapters, and he edited the manuscript and maybe made some grammar changes, that kind of thing. But in the introduction and the afterword, he kind of talks about the process of getting to know Joseph August Merasty as a person and his interactions with him. And he talks a lot about the process of getting this book together and how complicated it was. And, it took, 10 years or something for the whole process to take place, between getting letters or being approached by Augie to having a back and forth connection through letters and meeting once or twice. But it's a long, drawn out process of sort of tracking down Augie. And we learn a little about how Augie's past, his traumatic experiences in residential schools, how that has continued to impact his life, in his 70s and 80s, and his complete life has been sort of impacted by that traumatic experience as a child. And we see that in multiple different ways. So physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, Augie's whole being has been impacted by that residential school experience. And we learn about the different ways, relationships that are broken, struggles with alcoholism, homelessness, all of these sort of struggles become intertwined with his past and his childhood experience of the residential school system. So let's talk a little bit about David Carpenter. So he's sort of the co-writer or editor of Augie's memoir. And we learn a little bit about him. Augie reaches out to the English department at the U of S, and he's asking for some help with his manuscript. And he requests somebody, he wants a recommendation of a co-writer to come up to his cabin, tape his stories, and write them down for publication. And he's asking for somebody who has a strong or good command of the English language, who also has an outdoorish streak. And David Carpenter is recommended by the English department. So he's a former English professor at the University of Saskatchewan. He's a full-time writer and has published many, fiction and nonfiction. And he also has an outdoors interest. So they share that kind of common bond with Augie. And at first, David Carpenter, he's obviously intrigued by the story that Augie has to tell, but he is reluctant about helping Augie write the book. And at first he sort of turns him down. So he talks a little bit about that. So he says, this is page X111. He says, "It was in the writerly state that I at first said no to Augie, as I soon came to know him and his scheme to bring me, my spinning rod, and my tape recorder to the north. On the phone, I asked him to send me a copy of the story he had written for the commission, and he said he could not get copies of his submission. Suddenly, I began to realize something of the challenge that faced Augie, living in a cabin in the bush without electricity, and sometimes without a car, far from any town, on a new reserve with only 3 other houses." So he becomes aware that there's a lot of sort of challenges to working with Augie. And part of them is just getting the stories down. So Augie had first wanted to have Carpenter come up and record all the stories on a tape recorder, and then have Carpenter transcribe those stories to computer and then edit them. But then Carpenter says, "No, I need you to write your stories, or get those stories, that were written and sent off to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission." He wants that manuscript sent to him. So there's these 150 pages that Merasty sort of promises him that never really come to fruition. And Carpenter says, "I never saw all the pages that Augie referred to and promised to send me." So he is sent some, letters, and they have a sort of letter correspondence over those, 10 years in which they are working on this novel. But the 150 pages never really came through, I guess. Augie isn't able to sort of retrieve them and wasn't able to write them down. So the memoir is short, and we see that in those 9 chapters. And there's sort of blanks that Carpenter kind of fills in the introduction and the afterword, and fills us in on sort of what Augie was like as a person. He's sadly no longer with us. But we see the sort of chaos of Augie's life and how he has been impacted by this traumatic experience of residential school that he had as a child. So in the introduction, we learn various information about who Augie Merasty is. So Carpenter refers to him as a retired Cree trapper and fisherman. At the time that he contacts Carpenter, he's in his early 70s, and he's living in sort of the remote northern Saskatchewan, up in a cabin. And he's also referred to, this is on page 10, he's a retired fisherman and trapper and jack of all trades. So he's kind of, got a varied career and various interests. We can call him a memoirist in that he's written his memoirs, but he's also interested in art and has had various careers over the years. So Augie lives quite remotely in a cabin most of the time. So on page XX121, there's a description of Augie's sort of lifestyle and his house. So in one of his letters, he describes finishing his cabin. And his cabin is on the Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation Reserve at Birch Portage, just off Hanson Lake Road, west of Creighton. He was about to go moose hunting to stock up on jerky and pemmican for the winter. And then Augie writes, "It cost me about $50 a month for food up here." He mentioned that he had no water, no power, no cable, and he did have a radio that worked on batteries, unpolluted water, lots of game, wild chickens, rabbits, all the fish I want anytime, and no taxes. I am really getting out of the city life and will reside here at Birch Portage. So he describes this very sort of kind of off the grid life in northern Saskatchewan, and sort of living off the land. He talks a lot about hunting game and the water and fish that's abundant there. But there's no sort of conveniences that would make writing a novel easy. He doesn't have, internet, no power, no cable, no electricity. So these things, make this process a struggle for David Carpenter to get that manuscript together. And he ends up putting together the memoir based on 75 handwritten pages and the letters that Augie sends to him. But there's the question of the 150 pages that kind of go missing, that Augie promises to give him but never does. So the original story, Augie did send his manuscript, or his stories, his memoirs, to the Truth and Reconciliation, at that time the Working Group on Truth and Reconciliation, and to be used for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the court case. But those stories, he is not able to sort of get all of that manuscript back from his lawyers, and so Augie, or Carpenter, doesn't have access to those. So he does have just the handwritten pages that Augie sends him. We learn that Augie's life is complicated by a lot of hardship, and some of them we learn about how Augie struggles with depression and alcoholism. We also learn about some of his failed relationships with others and losing people he loves. There's one story, or we get one mention of Augie's first terrible heartbreak, and this is on page XV11. So what is that, 17? In the same letter, Augie went on to recall the first terrible heartbreak of his life, and he says, "I once contemplated ending it all 23 years ago when my wife of 30 years left me. It took me approximately 5 years to get back down to earth. I feel lucky I came out alive from the cesspool of booze. This time it took only months, and I had been dry for some time now." So we learn a little bit that, he had a previous marriage and children, but that relationship ended. He's gone on and had other relationships, and he talks about being sort of jilted by this younger woman, and how that leads to sort of moments of despair and sadness and depression. And it's during these times of his depression that he also falls into kind of bouts of alcoholism. And all of this kind of creates sort of cyclical or cycles of depression and alcoholism that kind of color his life, and kind of take him off this track of getting his memoir out there, having his story come to fruition or completion. So he's kind of, falls off track at times in his life and over these 10 years, and he becomes distracted from his life's purpose. So on page X1X, so 19, he recalls, or Carpenter recalls receiving a letter from Augie that recapped the sorrows of his life, his habit of driving all over the north and the western provinces to fight off despair, the long drinking bouts he had resumed, and the many deaths in his extended family that saddened him so. So there is, a lot of sadness and heartbreak in Augie's life, and it sort of is on top of his tragic experiences in residential school, and we see him sort of struggling with depression, alcoholism, and at times homelessness. So at the time that he contacts David Carpenter, he's also in his 70s. So he's nearing the end of his life, and he wants desperately to get his story out there and have a sort of outlet for his memoirs. And he feels this is like an important purpose of his life. If he can share his story with others, perhaps he could prevent or help somebody heal, or prevent something like this from happening again in the world. But he's clearly, he's struggling. He is a man in his 70s. There's a lot of health issues he's dealing with, and there's a list on page 28. Augie wrote with his obvious pride, but his hard life had taken its toll. I take pills daily and nightly for high blood pressure, diabetes, bladder and prostate glands, stomach and sleeping pills, even Tylenol 3s for 2 fractured ribs when I slipped on the ice 2 months ago. We also learned that he's sort of in and out of rehab centers, and obviously, his physical health is not where it used to be, and he struggles mentally as well as physically with his depression and addiction issues. So in the introduction, David Carpenter sort of refers to Augie as a kind of man who's divided, that there's almost 2 sides of him, a duality to his life and to his character. And he's divided between this chaotic side that pulls him down into despair, depression and alcoholism and, chaos. And then this other side of him that is heroic, that is driven, that is ambitious, that has purpose and drive to get his story out there and give his life, a purpose in these later years. So we see this kind of push and pull, these 2 sides of Augie depicted by Carpenter in this. So it's almost as if Augie was like 2 different people. Carpenter says on page 23, he says, and after our phone call, I began to wonder who would show up in Saskatoon, the reformed drinker bursting with new resolve to finish his story, or the despairing man who had fallen once again into a bottle. So there is this kind of push and pull, contradiction or duality that is part of Augie's character. And part of him, again, is struggling with the past still, and complicated by tragedy and hardship in his life. And then the other part of him is driven, pursuing this very noble, heroic goal of sharing his story, and that seems like what he wants most to do in this final stage of his life is to get his story out there for people to read and listen to. In this regard, Carpenter clearly sort of makes it clear that Augie is heroic in his efforts. We're not just talking about, a man who's, struggling with life. He is talking about somebody who is, despite all the odds and all the barriers that are against him, that this person is sort of striving, who's resilient. He'll use that word resilient a lot, to overcome these obstacles in order to get his voice out there. And on page 36, XXXV1, Carpenter says, clearly something has changed for the good, and that change came about in part because people like Augie Merasty spoke out against their oppressors, and because various people started to listen. I cannot escape the conviction, therefore, that I am writing about a hero. So he clearly is saying that, Augie is heroic in his efforts, and, I think we can agree with that, that it takes a lot of courage in order to come forward and share a story of tragedy and a story of, our own trauma that happened to us maybe as children, So it takes somebody who's very courageous and brave in order to come forward and talk about that kind of thing. And it's also, it becomes a kind of heroic statement and an important statement, and it can be changing for a lot of people to read Augie's memoir and learn something maybe they didn't formally know about the residential school system. And I know for, a lot of Canadians, they weren't taught about the residential school system. So having these people come forward like Augie and share their story, it really is eye-opening for so many people. And it's an important part of our education, as Canadians, to learn about what happened in our history.